to make you guys read. Okay, so chapter 6, Mishnah 5. We are continuing our complicated discussion, or rather our discussion of complicated buying and selling, the rights of buyers, the rights of the sellers, and the assumptions that are there when people are doing these things. And it's those assumptions, of course, that make problems. I will say once again, in large print, this isn't the fine print at the bottom of your credit card form, this is the large print. The Mishnah is talking about when they didn't say anything more clearly. You can make almost any deal you want to make. And as long as you and the person you're making the deal with agree, it's fine. Right? You can make a deal of, only on Tuesdays or only on Wednesdays. This is talking about when you made a deal and you weren't 100% clear. What are your rights? What are your responsibilities in those cases? Just remember that. If you want to make sure you don't have this problem, you spell it out before you sign, before you make the agreement. But sometimes people just make an agreement and they think everybody knows what it means. You end up in the Beit Din, and this is how they're going to decide the law, the halakha. We good on how this is set? Right? Doesn't mean you have to be sloppy. It just means if you're sloppy, this is what's going to happen. All right, chapter 6:5. I need a reader.
Introduction.
You can skip the introduction, just go straight to the bold.
If he has a cistern behind his fellow's house, he may go in. He may go in and out only at the time when others are accustomed to go in and out.
All right. So first of all, I have to point out that there's a slight difference in understanding of this Mishnah. And I make you bet that Natan's Mishnah probably translate this a little bit different. Does it say that the cistern is behind or in the other person's house?
Here it says in front.
In front. Okay. So there's a debate about exactly where within. See, like I said, so we've got in front of, we've got behind, and we've got inside.
Choose which one.
Well, it's unclear from exactly. It's pluralistic. But here's the problem. Right? The problem is, all right, this is my house. This is my fence that goes all the way around my property. And somewhere in here, there's a well. Not really a well, it's a cistern. A cistern, you may remember, it's like a water tank. We'll call it a tank just to be clear. Let's be precise, even if we can't tell you where it is. Maybe it's here, maybe it's here, maybe it's here, right? The issue is, I own the water tank, but you own everything else. How do I get to my water tank to get my water? Can I just middle of the night, just open the door, walk through your gate, walk into your house, get my water, and then leave? Right?
So the tank is part of the property of the other person.
Exactly. We'll call it tank belongs to Mr. A, right? And the house belongs to Mr. B, right? So the tank is Mr. A's tank, but Mr. A doesn't live there. Right? Only Mr. B lives there. So, and maybe Mr. B's family. So the question is, when can Mr. A use his tank? When can he have access to it?
I think it makes a difference. If Mr. A doesn't live there, we can go anytime.
No, Mr. A doesn't live there, but it's his tank.
His tank, yeah.
So when can he walk into Mr. B's house or Mr. B's yard? Right? When is he? And that's basically what our answer is, right? The answer is the default is when it's normal, right? When it's normal for people to come and go to each other's house. I mean, I know now we all live in the 21st century and nobody ever visits anyone else's house without having like 3 weeks worth of advance notice and invitations and all of that. I grew up watching I Love Lucy, and in I Love Lucy, Ethel Mertz would just open the door and walk in, right? That was what you did. If you were friends with someone, if you were neighbors, you just went into each other's homes. You didn't have to knock. You went in. Nowadays, you'd be arrested. And back in the days of the Mishnah, coming and going in other people's property was normal. Remember, we talked about how big your house was yesterday, right? Your house by default was tiny. Even if you had a bigger house, it wasn't huge. If you had a house the size of this room, that was pretty good size for most people. So most of what you did was outside the house. And so you saw people all the time. You interacted all the time. You'd be in and out of each other's property all the time. So coming and going to use my water tank on your property during normal times, that's fine.
Well, it wasn't so normal because we learned that crossing the field is a big issue. when you cross, when not, which path. So it wasn't so open there.
Right.
Everything.
But here the question is not when should you go, but when can you go? Because I own the cistern. I don't own your field, right? So I have, yes, you have a right to tell me, get off my lawn, right? Stay out of my field because I don't own it. But if I own the tank here, I do have a right to get to my tank.
Yeah, but the tank is under my property.
Exactly right. So when is my right and when are your rights? When do they work together? And when are they any problem? And the answer is, if it's normal time, then I have the right to get to my water and you can't stop me. You can't tell me no.
What is normal time defined?
When it's the time when people are accustomed to go in and out.
Normal
So
business.
normal business hours would be, now in the modern world, right? In the modern world, what the rabbis are saying is that it depends upon upon your contemporary custom. If it's normal for people to be up and working from dawn until nightfall, then that would be a normal time. On the other hand, nowadays, if you go to someone's house at 5 a.m., it's maybe they'll be awake, and if they're awake, they're not happy to see you because no one is happy at 5 a.m. anymore. Exactly, you're going to see the barrel of their gun. What are you doing here? Right? I thought you were a robber. So nowadays we'd probably say more like 9 to 5. Right? Or maybe even a little bit later, because with the lights and everything else, we stay up later and we're open later. So maybe it'd be fine for someone to come by even after nightfall if it was modern. So what they're saying is that there's a normal range of when people interact. If you come too early, you come too late, then the guy can shut the door and say, no, get your water tomorrow. But if you come during those hours, it would be normal. Now, again, if you want to make a contract that says you have 24 access to your cistern, you can make that deal, but the other guy has to agree to it. And if he wants to make if you want to make the deal that you can only do it between 12 a.m. and 1 a.m., and that's the only time you can do it, you can make that deal. This is the default.
It's like, when we were talking about property before, we had that whole thing about an easement where, and then so they get a specific easement where they can come and go.
Right, and again, that can also be you can arrange an easement by direct agreement, but this is talking about the idea that your coming and going is directly in his property, not out in a field.
But actually, the one I was thinking about, I forget it was the pole, but they said he had to buy his access. Remember?
Pole.
Maybe it wasn't a pole, but there was a specific thing, and I think the sage said no, he had to buy the access.
Right. I think you're talking about the case of like with a tree in the middle of a field, and you have to have the right. If you sell everything else in the field except the tree, the owner of the tree has to negotiate access to get back to his tree because he sold the rest of the field.
Right. How come he doesn't have to buy his access to the tank?
He might have,
Oh.
but even with access to the tank, he doesn't have access at all hours.
And is that because it's close to the house? Like if it was in
Exactly.
a field, he would.
Exactly right. That's why it's saying in his fellow's house or property, meaning by his house. There's a different standard of when you should expect a person to drop by and not drop by. Right? If he wants to go use the cistern on my field out in the middle of nowhere, he can use it anytime. Right? He's not disturbing anyone. This is not a nuisance. And this is talking about if it's my house, it's a nuisance. Especially as we continue reading, if you wouldn't mind, Richard, we're going to see how nuisance it can be.
And he may not bring in his cattle and let them drink from this cistern. Rather, he must draw water and let them drink. Oh, let them drink outside.
Okay, so if you've got cows, you don't get to bring all of your cows onto my property and have them drink from the water tank. If you want your cows to drink the water from my property, you've got to get the buckets, take it to the cows, and let them drink outside. And then you can get more water and let them drink and more and let them drink.
Common sense.
It's only common sense if you're the homeowner. If you're the guy who says, but it's my water, I want to use it the way I want to use it. Why should I have to carry my water? Right? Let my cows drink their water. It's my water, for crying out loud. Right? It's only fair if you can imagine yourself being on one side more than the other. But if you can imagine the frustration of the cow guy, right? And we'll call him, the cowboy, then he's having difficulty going, I don't want to carry hundreds and hundreds of gallons of water to water my cows. Just let me walk them in. Now, again, you can negotiate and you can make that bargain. And if the guy agrees to it, absolutely, you can get the right to get them to come and go. But if you didn't make that deal, the default is no cows.
Is the fact that this is different than the cistern in the field, is there any commentary that makes people believe that the cistern was inside the house, which is why we have these special rules versus the field?
It's definitely a question of the proximity to the home, right? And that's indeed why the commentators argue about in or near, but they all agree that it would be a nuisance to the homeowner to have people coming in at all times and having cows come in at any time, right? Yes, people expect animals and livestock. That's kind of normal, but it's not normal for you to bring them onto my personal, like intimate property for whatever purpose. And if you want to do that, we're going to have to make a deal for that. And then the second part is going to tell us a good way to make sure this works.
And he and the owner of the house should each make themselves a lock.
Okay, and just in case you thought the owner of the house was always getting the upper hand here, the owner of the house should have a lock on the property, and the owner of the tank should have a lock on the tank, right? That way the house owner can't use the water, and the water owner can't use the house without each other's permission, right? Good locks make good neighbors. Because you can imagine, right? It's like a guy goes on vacation. How do you know whether he's coming in at the wrong time? If I go on vacation, how do I know whether or not you're using my water, right? It's difficult. Is that a question or you just, okay. All right, 6:6. We will get to chapter 7 tonight, I promise.
If he had a garden behind his fellow's garden, he may go in and out only at the time when others are accustomed to go in and out.
All right, so now we're dealing with not a water property, but we're dealing with, I've got my garden, in the back of your house, and I want to go and get to my garden. What time can I walk to and go to my garden? And the answer is during normal hours, just like it was for getting the water. Now that we've got it set up, a little quicker. Onward.
And he may bring in merchants.
He may not.
He may not bring in merchants or enter through it into another field. The owner of the outer garden may plant seeds on the path.
Okay, so before we get to the path seeds, I just personally love the idea that the merchants are the parallel to the cows, right? Which is basically like you can't bring your cows onto my property to drink my water, and you can't bring your merchants onto my property to collect the produce. Right? I'm not having a dozen guys coming in here picking tomatoes so that you can sell the garden. If you want to sell the tomatoes from your garden, you pick them, you carry them off my property, and then you sell them. Right? Because it's just like cows, you don't want to have the merchants. So then the second part is dealing with this issue of the seeds, but we want to make sure that we get the idea here is that the owner of the outer garden, right? So this is Mr. B, right? Mr. B says, we're going to need to do a top-down view. All right, so this is the house. This is what happens when I try to use colors. My brain doesn't think in colors. All right, so there's the house. It's Mr. B's house. That's why it's blue. And we're looking it down now, the Google Map version. And we've got the property here. And in the back, right, we have Mr. A's garden in the back of Mr. B's property. And the question is, I need one more color. We'll use black. That's the path to get to the garden. Can Mr. B plant along that path? Can he put down seeds along that path? That's his. So yes, he is allowed. Even though that may make things inconvenient for Mr. A, it is Mr. B's property. So Mr. B is allowed to plant along that seed. Plant seeds along that path.
But who is the owner of the path?
B.
B is the owner of the path.
Everything except the garden belongs to Mr. B. All this territory.
We didn't learn that he need to pay also the path, the way?
So the idea here is there's a difference between paying for the use and actual ownership of the path. So Mr. A would still have the right to get to his garden, right? Even though that now has plants on it, Mr. A would still have the right to get to his garden. But Mr. B has the right to actually put plants there. And so
B is the owner.
B is
A
the
cannot buy. A only buy the right to work over, but
exactly.
not the possession of the
Exactly. He doesn't own the ground of the path.
Yeah.
So yeah, by the way, this is why you should never make these deals because it gets really, really complicated and it makes for a lot of very angry people. But if you did, and sometimes you just had to, right? Maybe your ground was not working right, or maybe there was some other problem and you needed another piece of ground and Mr. B had a little extra. Okay, so he's going to help you and you're going to be able to have enough food. You'll make a deal. But you have to be prepared that there are going to be these arguments. And that's why the halakha is trying to say, this is how we'll settle these arguments.
Rabbi,
Yes.
do we learn that if something grows over the path, then he can no longer use it if you can't identify where it was?
We talked about that for a case of a public path, right? If there's a field where there's a certain path that everybody uses, that even if it gets replanted, it's still allowed to be used. But if it becomes completely overgrown and no one can remember where the path was, then you lose your public rights to it.
So on a private path, you got to estimate where it was and recreate it?
In a private piece of property with a path where no one actually gave the official rights, but it's been used by sort of common usage.
Like this one?
No, this one is not. This one is a specific agreement for Mr. A.
Well, that's a specific agreement.
Yeah, this is not everybody and their brother can walk across Mr. B's front lawn.
Yeah.
This is Mr. A can because he's got a garden in the back.
But that was an implied agreement though, right?
Because of the garden agreement, yes. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah, it's just what if you can no longer identify where the path was, does he get to create a new path?
Well, he still gets to go to Mr. B can't block him completely. So Mr. B couldn't just like make a wall that prevented Mr. A from ever getting to his garden again.
So they have to create a new path then.
There would need to be some other way for Mr. A to get there. Yes. Okay. Next chunk. But
with the other's consent, he has been given a path at the side of the other's garden. He may go in and out when he wishes, and he may bring in merchants, but he may not enter through it into another field, and neither of them has the right to plant seeds on the path.
okay, so this is case number 2, which is different than what we just talked about. This is, where's my colored pen? This is Mr. B says to Mr. A, you get your own path. Right? This is the agreement, right? That's the idea of consent. You get to have your own path. Now, this is still Mr. B's property, but they made the agreement that this path would be set aside for Mr. A and Mr. A's garden usage. If they do that, then Mr. A can use it and the merchants can come and go at the normal times. That's perfectly fine. But no one can plant on that path. Mr. A can't plant because it's just a path. And Mr. B can't plant because he agreed that that would stay open for Mr. A. And the idea of not going to another field, which we've mentioned a couple times now, just want to make sure we get that clear, that if there is, for example, the rest of Mr. A's property back there, Mr. A, if he lives here, he can't just take a shortcut and go to his other field. Right? This path is not allowed to become a road. That's just his normal way of walking to his field. This path is to get to the garden, not to anything else. So if he wants to go to his field, he has to go out and around to go to his field. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. 6, 7. Moving along. Wow. Look at that. 2 Mishnahs in half an hour.
If a public path passes through a man's field and he took it,
20
he gave,
minutes.
What?
20 minutes.
Yeah, I know we started a bit late, but we always start late.
if a public path passes through a man's field and he took it and gave them another path by the side of the field, what he has given, and what he has taken for himself does not become his.
Okay. Everybody in America is going to love this one. Because people don't like the way Judaism sometimes handles private property. They like it sometimes and not others. We're going to need another drawing. This is getting back to our topic of what happens about a public path that goes through a field. Right, so we'll stick with Mr. B because he's just our default property owner. All right, so this is all Mr. B's field. Right, we are actually out in the field. We're not at his house. This is his field outside the town. And let's imagine that, there's a nice lake over here, all right, and the town is over here. And everyone likes to go swimming in the lake. And for the last, as long as anyone can remember, 100 years, 150 years, everyone walks to the lake across Mr. B's field. Right now, as we said, this has been established as public custom. They have the right to go across your field because this is established. You can't take it back from the public option. But Mr. B doesn't like people walking through his field. So he goes to them and he says, okay. Tell you what I'll do. Because I'm such a nice guy, I'm going to make a path that goes around the edge of my field. Right? I'll even put down paving stones, make it real nice for you, and it'll be great for everyone to go to the lake. The town can say, that's nice. We'll take that. But we get to keep this too. Right? What he gives. And what he's taken does not become his, right? So he's trying to give it so he can take back that middle path.
Only if they sign a contract.
But you can't sign a contract on behalf of the public, right? There's no public to sign a contract, right? So this is where, like I said, in America, private property is like king. In Jewish law, you had to make concessions for public use, right? If there was a common path that everybody in town was used to using, you can't just take that away from the town. And there's no one in the town who could give you permission to take that away.
Did the town have any representative?
Not in that way. I mean, yes, the town usually would have like a town group of elders that would get together and make decisions if necessary. And of course, they would go to the rabbis in the Beit Din if there was a halachic decision. If they wanted to decide, do we need a new aqueduct, the town would decide that together. They didn't need rabbinic decision on that. But if they had a matter of law, they would go to the court to ask about the law.
What about if they wanted to change their path?
So they could, but it wouldn't be binding upon every member of the town, right? So let's say they all get together and they all say, oh, okay, Mr. B, we're going to use the new path, right? But there's one guy in town who is stubborn and he wants to keep using the old path. You can't stop him. Right? He has the right to use it because it is a public spot, and public spots can't be taken away by private individuals. This is a little bit similar. It's like in I forget the term in modern American law. It's like how people call every soda a Coke, right? But some sodas are actually Pepsi, right, or something else. But Coke has tried to fight for years to prevent that from happening, from their name becoming a public word. Same thing happened with Kleenex. Same thing happened with Hoover, the vacuum in England. All vacuums are called Hoovers in England because the first brand was that. So can a company or a private citizen force the public to stop using this area? And it turns out, if it gets to a certain point, no, they can't.
What do you mean by private citizen, though? Because obviously the owner of the field wouldn't be able to do it, but the town's representatives, are they
If you are the only person who walks through Mr. B's field,
yeah,
you do not have a right to do that. If you and your buddy are the only people who walk through Mr. B's field, you do not have a right to do that. But at a certain tipping point, everyone knows that's how you get to the lake. And now Mr. B cannot stop you from doing that. And that tipping point, of course, is what's decided by the courts. And that's similar to American law, where the courts decide whether or not Coca-Cola can still, sue someone for selling Coke that isn't Coca-Cola, or selling Kleenex that isn't Kleenex. All right, or they have to call it facial tissue, and those arguments are very important arguments. It's like the word Google has now become part of our verbs. If I say I need to Google something, if I write that out, do I capitalize the G or not? Do I have to say I'm going to Bing it if I'm not actually going to use Google, but I am going to use a search engine? Right? No one would say that. I'm going to Google it. Even if they weren't using Google, they still say I'm going to Google it. And nowadays, I don't think anybody would still capitalize the G in Google because they don't mean it as a reference to the brand anymore. It has been taken away. It has been public. It has been made part of the public domain. And that is what we're talking about here, is that there is such a thing as a public domain, and you can't take it away, even if you give us an alternative, right? Even if you say, look, use that, then you've given that away. And now you've lost it, but you didn't gain the part that you were trying to take back, right? Public domain is a powerful concept in Jewish law, right? The public have rights that no one can take away. Now, how those rights develop, well, that's complicated. As we saw in one of the earlier Mishnahs, there are some rabbis who felt that just because the public was doing things like this, that didn't make it right, that they were really, robbers that were just accustomed to going through your field. But the fact remains is this public domain has been made public. Now, nowadays, when we have laws that are much clearer of who owns what property, Natan will tell you that when they do a real estate sale, there has to be a clear survey of where your property begins and where it ends and all of that. Right? Yes, that was also in Jewish law, but there was still also a lot of unclaimed territory in some places. And the public had the right to use that. And if the public was accustomed to using it, and then you showed up and proved that it was yours, they didn't have to stop walking across that path. Right? You come back after 50 years and you say, yes, my family moved to Spain, but now we're back in Israel. And look, we have proof that this is our property. People say, great, welcome home, but we're still walking down this path to the lake. Right, this is our public right. And there's nothing you can do about it. Again, under Mishnah law. I'm pretty sure that modern Israeli law has a different opinion, but I'm not 100% sure. One very similar case to this, which is the opposite, is in Malibu, California. As a Southern Californian and someone who lived not too far from Malibu when I was at university and for smicha, there's a very famous part of Malibu Beach that is a public beach. One of the weirdest things when I first came to Florida was the idea of private beaches. Like all along the East Coast, you have private beaches. Not in California, right? In California, your property ends at the sand. You don't get to own the sand, which means that if someone wants to walk down the beach and stick an umbrella and lay on a towel in front of your house, tough. That's public property. The beach is public property. And there is a small path in Malibu, very famous now, that goes from a public parking lot past $1 million houses down to the Malibu beach. Well, the people who own those $1 million houses, they don't like their beach being accessible to the population, to the public, the rest of us dirty people. And so they put up gates and they put up locks and they try to keep people out. And people will come with bolt cutters and cut the chains and walk to the beach anyway. And they'll call the cops. The cops will show up and the cops will say it's public property. They take them to court. They take the city to court. They sue the state. It's been going on now since I was a kid. For 40 years, people have been fighting over their right to walk down this path. It's very clear that it is public property, but the people who live there do not want it to be public property. And they keep trying to stop cutting the path over and over again to keep people from using it. And now there are people who have spent their whole life fighting to keep walking down the path. And so, yeah, this is not just an ancient issue. So if you ever go to the Malibu, go to the beach. It's your right as a visitor of California. And you might need bolt cutters. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about what is a public or private path and all of these things.
A private path is 4 cubits.
All right, remember a cubit is about 18 inches, technically finger to elbow. But it works out to be about 18 inches when standardized. So a private path is 4 cubits. That's basically about as wide as this, about 6 feet, as a path. A public path, on the other hand, is
Path is 60 cubits.
16 cubits, right? So 16 cubits is 16 plus 8 is 24, right? Yeah, it's about 24 feet across. So it's about the width of this room, right? That's considered a public path.
Public, private, how many?
Private?
Four.
Private is this, 4.
How many feet?
About 6. About 2 meters. And a public path is about 8 meters, 24 feet, which is about this room. Maybe just a little bigger than this room, maybe. All right, and the king's path.
The king's path had.
I'm sorry. The private path, you said is 6 meters.
No, 6 feet.
6 feet.
Or no, the private path. The private path is 2 meters. The public path is 8 meters. It's 4 times bigger.
What
Okay.
do you mean by king?
Well, hold on. Let's make sure we get this. The king's path.
The king's path has no prescribed measure.
Okay, so what do we mean by the king? We mean the king, right? An actual flesh and blood king. If the king is coming, how wide can his group walk and still be considered to be part of his path? And the answer is as wide as they need. So if the king is marching, his group of people down to the city, and they're walking through a field and they're walking through, your property, tough.
But king in the days of this would have been Caesar.
Kings in the days of this, yes, would have been Roman, but they still had the idea that a legitimate king had a legitimate right to walk anywhere they wanted. Caesar didn't care about halakha,
Right.
and we weren't going to force him to care because that would start a war. So the Caesar could walk wherever he wanted anyway. But even a Jewish king could technically walk wherever he wanted with as many people as he wanted, and you weren't allowed to complain.
As I say, but the Hasmoneans and the Herod dynasty were not legitimate kings.
Well, not exactly. I mean, the Hashmonean dynasty at the beginning, we can argue about whether or not it was appropriate or inappropriate, but they were definitely not Davidic kings.
Right.
But they still did have the right to act as a ruler at the time.
Really?
Most of the rabbis did say they had the right to rule. They just didn't do a very good job of it.
I thought they were illegitimate kings.
Well, they got more and more illegitimate as they got worse and worse. The idea that it's a whole nother conversation, but the idea that you can have a non-Davidic king rule an area until there is a proper restoration of the Davidic kingdom is acknowledged.
What about like Herod? He'd be a puppet king.
Well, then, yeah, he wasn't liked and he wasn't considered to be a good king or necessarily even a real Jewish king or legitimate king. But by that point, we didn't have our own independence to be able to stop him, right? Because Herod was backed up by the Romans. But the idea of there being a non-Davidic authority in rulership of the land is precisely the way the state of Israel works right now,
And
right? Because
Nasi wouldn't count, right? No. Nasi.
the Nasi would not count with this level of deference. He would not be given this much room to move about. However, let's talk about someone else that is given this much room.
The path to a grave has no prescribed measure.
Okay. If you are carrying a body and you are taking them to the funeral, to the place where they are buried, you can walk wherever you need to walk, right? And if there are 1 million people following this person to the grave, 1 million people can walk behind the grave. You can't say, get in the line. You're not allowed. You get to the back, right? Scrunch up. No, we are escorting the dead. We are able to use as much room as we need. Now, most people don't get 1 million people, but the idea that both somebody who is dead and somebody who is the king receive the same measure is a beautiful insight, right? That when you are dead, you are treated like a king. And if it needs 1 million people to bury you properly, then 1 million people can march with your coffin. Well, body in the case of the Mishnah, they didn't use coffins, but that's a whole nother conversation. And then finally, as long as we're talking about death,
The halting places, according to the judges of Zippori, should be 4 cob space of ground.
right. So the halting places were Even to this day, we still use this, although it's much shorter because we are usually walking from the chapel at our cemetery to the grave. But as you carry a body to the grave, you stop along the way. Traditionally, in the modern world, it's about 7 times that you stop. But in the ancient world, remember, you would be walking from the person's house to the graveyard. Right? That might be a mile or more. And so what you would do is you would carry the body for a while, you would stop, you would give the hesped, the eulogy, and then you would move on to the next one, and you would stop, and you would give another eulogy, another lament, and so on until you finally got to the grave. Like I said, nowadays, because of the way we structure our communities and our cemeteries, it's a little different, but this is talking about that. Now, the idea of how big is one of these stopping places, and if you used a stopping place as a measure of area, how big would you mean, to get us sort of back on track when we're talking about distances? If you said stopping area, it's 4 kav, which, if you remember, kav is the amount that you would use to sow the ground for the seeds. And according to my commentary, at least, that's about 25 meters by 17 meters. Right? That's how big of an area it is, which is a pretty good size chunk of land. Right? Not enough to make your giant fortune farm, but it's a pretty good sized chunk of land. We're good? All right, 6-8. Told you we'd finish. Ah, you got the long one.
You said here, and long. You move again. Yeah.
Exactly. Natan, God wants to hear the Mishnah from your lips.
Yeah.
One who sells a place to his fellow to make him a grave, and so one who accepts from his fellow to make him a grave, makes the inside of the board 4 amot by 6, and he opens into it 8 cribs. 3 on this side, and 3 on this side, and 2 opposite them.
Keep reading.
And the cribs, the length is to be 4 amot, and the height 7 and 7, and the width 6.
All right, those are tfachim, handbreadths. Okay, so we'll pause there. So first of all, this isn't a grave in the way we describe it in the modern world. This is a cave carved into a mountain. So the most common form of burial at this time, when the Mishnah was being written, that was done in the land of Israel, was to carve into the mountain a cave, and then to make like bunk beds for the bodies that you would put inside that area. And if you go to Beit She'arim near the Galil in Israel, it is the most amazing thing. It happens to be the place most authorities believe to have been the actual burial site of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the person who put together the Mishnah. There's another traditional site that's not too far away, but it's unlikely that that's the real one. The one that they discovered there has a beautiful way of doing exactly what's being discussed here. So if you hire a contractor and you say, build me a grave, build me a tomb, then he's going to take in a mountain, he's going to dig inside, and he's going to dig into the cave, something that looks like this. And there's going to be, it's going to be like this times 3, meaning 3 levels of areas for the bodies. And it's going to be over here and over here. It's going to be for 2. All right, so there's going to be enough for 8 people, 8 bodies to be buried in this area. Now, a little bit of an aside, the Mishnah doesn't describe it, but it's important to know. Anyway, what would happen would be is you would take the bodies, you would put them on the stone inside this area, and then the body would fall apart. Right? The body would decompose. And then you would gather all the bones together, and you would put them in a new box called an ossuary. We did speak about it before, but I'm not sure everybody was here. And that's like a little stone box.
All the 3 mentioned? All the 3 bodies?
Well, not all at once. So, maybe on the top level was your grandfather and the middle level was your father. Well, grandfather falls apart first. You gather him. The father, you're still waiting. and then when he's done, you gather him, and then the bottom slot, that's yours. Right? You're going to be lying there, and your son will take care of you. And then when someone else needs it, they can go up on the top slot. Right? And then the ossuaries would be stored in little niches in the wall as well, but you don't take as much room when you're only bones.
There was public places because it must be very expensive to build something like that in the mountains.
So yes and no. There were graves for paupers, and these were not as nice, right? And those were usually just places where you would put the body in the ground. But you could do that almost anywhere. You didn't need to make a big deal out of it. Now, you had to have it marked so that the Kohanim would know this was an area where there were bodies in. But yes, this was the preferred way to take care of the dead.
That's expensive.
Well, but you could also buy a place in someone else's. Right? You didn't have to own the whole. Just like now, we have a cemetery. It's not only for the people who own the cemetery. It's for anybody who wants to buy a piece of the cemetery. So if you wanted to buy a piece, that was also fine. By the way, when we talk about the cave of Machpelah, which was where Abraham bought for Sarah, it probably was something like this, that it was a natural cave, but the idea was that there would be multiple places for putting the bodies inside. Now, yes, this would have smelled, right? If you lived at this time, going to the graveyard would have been a very powerful experience because of the aroma of death from the people that were there. By the way, those of you who are aficionados of the Christian Bible, when they talked about where Jesus was buried, it would have been something like this, right? When they put him in a tomb, right? That was what was happening. And it wasn't a rock, like a big boulder in the front. They had stone doors. If you go, like I said, if you go to Beit She'arim up in Israel, up in the north, you can still see the old stone doors. And you would just move the stone door when you wanted to bring a body in. The doors were quite small. And then you crouch in, you go through, and then you're inside this larger area for the burials. Good? Well, not good.
This is a very ecological system, but it's reusable.
Yes. There is this works out quite well at minimizing the permanent land use for the dead, and you don't have to worry about the lawn. You don't have to worry about the gardening for this. Because it's underground. It's not like grass is going to grow.
It's a big problem.
It's a big problem in parts of America.
Yeah.
Go to Long Island and try and find a grave. Right. It's a big area, a big problem in many areas. But yeah, Israel especially doesn't have a lot of extra room. I mean, at least America, we could always bury people in Wyoming, but Israel doesn't have Wyoming in its backyard.
So the bodies were there was no wood, nothing. They're just the bodies.
Well, they were wrapped. They were wrapped.
Yeah, wrapped, but that's it.
That was it. No coffin. Yeah. The idea of having the aron, the coffin that we use now for burial, is a more modern thing. And even actually to this day in Israel, when someone is buried, they don't bury them usually with a coffin. They're wrapped and then lowered. The body is lowered into the grave, not a box, but the actual body.
It's cheaper.
It is cheaper, but that's not the reason.
That's the way it should be, right?
You need to go back to the land of Israel. So that's why you don't use any
Well, you need to go back to the land wherever you are.
Yes, also here in America, when you prepare you for the funeral, they throw you also a little land from Israel in order to build contact. But in Israel,
And they leave also the coffin, they leave an opening so it touches the ground.
Right. So
Open to the ground.
right. So to do a little bit of a digression to do a little digression into American and Israeli burial practices. Yes, according to Jewish understanding, the body should be allowed to return to the earth. Right. We came from the Adamah. We go back to the Adamah. That's what makes us Adam. Right. We came from the earth. We go back to the earth. That's what makes us a human being. So anything that unnecessarily delays or, God forbid, prevents that is something that Jewish law frowns upon. That's why you don't see Jewish people getting buried in big bronze metal caskets. It's also why you don't see Jewish people getting buried above ground, right? You don't see Jewish mausoleums where you're putting the body in a big stone building that's 30 feet in the air. That's not a Jewish burial practice. Instead, you have to be buried underground. So even though these caves are something you can walk into, it's inside of a mountain, and therefore it is underground, and it is allowed. So in America, however, most cemeteries and most states have rules about how a person gets buried. And so we've had to make certain accommodations. So that's why we use coffins in the US. It's also why we usually will use a liner, a concrete sleeve to keep the vault, to keep the dirt level. Because, you know, when a person dies and their body falls apart, if it's inside of a coffin, when the coffin falls apart, the dirt sinks down. And that creates the dip. If you go to like old cemeteries in America, or like in New England, or even out in the West, you'll find the cemeteries are all like this, because that's where the coffin has collapsed and the air was then filled by the dirt above. So most American cemeteries now put concrete in, and they put a concrete shell over the top. Now, one, concrete is a type of dirt. Most authorities are okay with that. But they also cut at the bottom a big opening, so that when the body falls apart, when the coffin falls apart, the person returns to the earth underneath as well. So that is the way that it is usually handled in most cemeteries, in most Jewish cemeteries in this country.
What happens when you run out of space? Like, are you trying to build over?
Yeah.
And make a mechanism, like, for example, push like kind of fake mountains with fake land.
Well, you can so
continue growing.
yes,
Grow
yes,
over.
and yes, right. So if you read some of the responses of the Middle Ages, when Jews were being pushed into ghettos, it was a very real problem, because if you live in a ghetto, you don't have a lot of extra room. Right? Even if there's plenty of room in the rest of Italy, if you're living in the Venice ghetto, you don't have access to the rest of the territory. And so they would bury people in multiple layers going down. So the first person would be buried way down, and then covered, and then the next person would be buried middle, and then covered, and then the next person would be buried a little bit more, and then covered.
Boxes or without boxes?
At different times, they had different traditions depending upon where you lived. But that was, you were just there under that. And if they needed to put all new dirt and raise, I never heard of that being needed, but it was conceivable, yes. As long as the person remains under and they're not needlessly disturbing those who have been laid to rest, you are allowed to continue to do this.
So you can be born in a diaspora in a box without a box. I thought that only in Israel is without a box. And in a diaspora, you need to be with a box.
So the problem isn't whether you can or can't. The problem is whether the local cemetery will allow it, or whether you live somewhere that allows the burial by your own wishes. So every state, every county has their own rules on a lot of this. But every cemetery demands a coffin. Right? I've never seen a cemetery that doesn't demand it. And since the cemetery is technically private property, they can make their own rules. Right? They could force you to do whatever they want if you're going to use their cemetery.
But in the halacha, you don't have to have a coffin if you are in the diaspora?
No, you don't. And the halacha doesn't say that you need a coffin in the diaspora. But most local laws prefer people to be buried in a coffin. But there's nothing in halacha that says you have to be.
I think in Israel, they started arguing if it's possible to do this level.
Right.
Because they're running out of room.
So it's not an argument. I mean, everybody recognizes that it is permissible, but it's not.
Argument, it's just.
But it's not preferred.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. But what about the Negev? Right, you got hundreds of miles of nothing.
Tell Israel,
Negev
go
technically is an
visit
Israel, isn't
his parents in the Negev.
Well,
He's gonna
wait.
revolt.
So my grandmother was buried in San Diego. Well, what am I going to do? Drive across country to visit her? Right? My grandfather was buried up in Los Angeles in a veteran cemetery. You know, I can't expect to be able to go see them. In America, people are used to the fact that we can't see our relatives as frequently as we would like in the places where they were laid to rest.
Israel is the opposite.
Well,
Just
it's
to
next
see-
door,
Yeah.
exactly. But you know what? At a certain point,
So,
next door is
yeah,
not an
it
option.
changed.
The Negev's greater Israel, though, isn't it?
Hmm?
Isn't the Negev? I thought that wasn't part of biblical the promised land.
But there's no law that says you have to be buried within inside the narrowest
Yeah.
version of the biblical lands.
Oh, I thought that, but I thought a lot of people wanted to return.
Of course. I mean, there's a lot of people who believe that if they're buried on Har Zaitim, the Mount of Olives, that they're going to be brought back first, right? Before everyone else. So that's why Mount of Olives is covered in all of the tombs. But that doesn't mean that if you're buried in Australia, that you're not coming back. Right? You're buried in Australia, you're still going to be there for the Mechayim Eitim. You're still going to be there when God resurrects the dead. It's just, what are you going to be later?
You need to have some records.
Yeah.
So, but can you reuse a cemetery by Jewish law? If you transfer
It's complicated.
everything
It's complicated.
for the bodies?
So as you can see in this system, yes, there is a way to make it reusable, right? Because the space where the bodies were initially laid was not where they stayed forever. But it is something that has become even more controversial and delicate as this has become less common. Because most of the places where Jews went to live, we didn't have the option of making our tombs like this. And so most of us have gotten used to the idea of putting a person in the ground, covering it with dirt, and never moving anything ever again. Technically, yes, for the kavod, for the honor of the deceased, there are ways that you can disinter. You can take the body out and you can reinter it somewhere else. But most people are uncomfortable with that nowadays.
But what happened like
So there's always a difference between halacha and what people are comfortable with.
What happens if it's after, let's say, 50 years or 100, there is no more body?
Okay.
How can you do the transfer? Because I'm thinking the place. Like, for example, I saw that I went to the cemetery, I don't know why, in Netanya.
Mhm.
It's a prime piece of land. Okay? And come a point that they
Right.
will need the land because it's a big piece of land, a very good place.
So this
So what happened? They need and they decided, okay, we need to build there on the cemetery.
So this is practical halacha lamase in Israel, not because of the Netanya cemetery, but because everywhere in Israel has had somebody buried sometime in the last 10,000 years.
Yeah.
It's just there has been so much living there that there's also been a lot of dying. And so when they are building a new building or a new freeway, and they come across the bodies of people, well, whether it's a cemetery or a single body, they have to make decisions about whether or not this needs to be done or not. Now, usually in the modern world, they tend to prefer, if it is a modern grave, if it's a recent grave, for some reason that it got lost and now it's being discovered, they will try to preserve it. But if it's ancient, the archaeologists come in, they study what they can, they take what they need to if they can, and then they keep building. Right, but that becomes a big argument. There's been a lot of controversy about building through areas that seem to be sites of antiquities, because then people say, but the Kohanim can't go here, and how do we know? And you're creating tumah, ritual impurity. It's become...
That's not what, doesn't matter. We are all
We are all tameh.
impure.
Yeah, we are all impure. Very important to remember, but there are some people who are very angry if you make it so that it would be easier to be impure, even if, yes, we're already impure. So there are many protests in Israel about the handling of graves that are uncovered through different construction projects. And that has to be resorted by the local rabbinut, and the government gets involved, and protesters are involved. It becomes quite a balagan. It can be a big mess. So, and then, because otherwise you can't build anything, right? If every time you dig, there's a 1 in 10 chance you're going to hit a body, then how do you ever build the city? How do you build a new city? How do you build a road? So the whole tunnels that the new latest peace plan talks about. What happens if you're drilling a tunnel and you come across a body, right? Do you just turn? It doesn't work. So usually the answer is to, if it seems to be an actual body rather than like ancient fossilized bones, usually they will try to reinter it if necessary. But sometimes they'll just cover it over and build on top. So yeah, it's very controversial in Israel right now. Well, has been for a while, but as Israel has expanded so much construction in the last 20, 30 years, it's gotten to be even more of a hot topic. Okay, we are not done. We're not done. You're still reading because you have the long one.
We went far.
No. We're still talking about the tombs. It's okay. It's just our Gemara.
Rabbi Shimon says he makes the inside of the board 6 amot by 8, and he opens into it 13 cribs, 4 on the sides and 4 on the sides, and 3 opposite them, and 1 to the right of the entrance and 1 to the left.
So he has his own picture of what the inside of the vault should look like. But keep reading because there is still Rabbi Shimon.
And he makes a courtyard in front of the board, 6 by 6, the size of a bear, and those pouring it.
All right, so this is talking about the entryway, right? You have to make sure the entryway is big enough for the people carrying the body.
This Rabbi Shimon was an architect because a very clear picture.
So actually, Rabbi Shimon is arguing, he's going to add his own argument to that. That's actually the Tanakama, the main voice.
Oh, okay. And he opens into it 2 boards, 1 on this side and 1 on this side.
But Rabbi Shimon says 4.
Let's make it back, because I started Rabbi Shimon says.
Yeah, so Rabbi Shimon says, right, and then sort of he stops, and then he must make a courtyard. And then Rabbi Shimon also comments about the courtyard.
Rabbi Shimon says 4 on all 4 sides.
Right? So in the entryway, you should have one in the front, in the back, and the sides, right? You should make more spots. You can see Rabbi Shimon believes that the whole area should be bigger if you're building a tomb. If you're hiring someone to build you a tomb, it needs to have more spots for more bodies. That seems to be Rabbi Shimon's position. But Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel is going to finish chapter 6 with some very good practical advice.
All is in accordance with their work.
Right? It depends, right? If the rock lets you build that much, build that much. If the rock doesn't, don't.
But what if the rocks allow you, but you don't have the need? It's not a waste of place and everything.
So again, this is talking about the default, right? So if you hire a contractor and you say, I want you to build me a tomb and just put 2 spots in it, that's fine. Then you both agree, you set a price, he does the work, he's done, you're happy, it's fine. This is, I want you to build me a tomb. I'll come back next week. And you show up and you go, wait a minute, this isn't what I wanted. That's where the Mishnah comes in. But Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel is saying what's going to happen and why you can't make a fixed rule is you're going to say, build me a tomb. The contractor is going to start digging, and he's going to dig as many spots as he thinks he can. And then when you show up and you say, I wanted more, he'll tell you, I can't make more. The rock won't let me. And then you go to court, and then the court will have to decide whether the contractor is being honest or whether he's incorrect about that. Right? If you're unhappy with what he did, right? If he makes 1 and says, "Oh no, I can't make any more," then you can take him to court and force him to finish the job. But if he's made 10 and you wanted 12, but he says in his expert opinion the rock won't let me make 12, then you're going to be stuck with 10 if he's being truthful. Make sense?
Yeah.
All right. So we will hold off on chapter 7, but at least we finished chapter 6.
You were so happy at the beginning and moved so fast.
I know, but then we had a good digression. It was good halacha l'maaseh and a little bit of politics. It's good to have those other conversations. Chapter 7 is going to be about buying land again, but it's about what quality does the land have to be, right? If I'm buying a field, does it have to be smooth? Can it be rough? What am I buying? And then chapter 8, chapter 7 is very short. It's only 4 Mishnayot. And then chapter 8, we get to talk about inheritance, which is everybody's favorite topic, right? What happens when someone dies?
In this book, they have actually a drawing.
Oh, they have a picture?
Yeah.
Nice.
How you have it?